Member for Saanich North and Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, also known as Red Dress Day. And earlier this week, this Assembly has celebrated a new anti-racism data collection initiative, a new bill. Yesterday afternoon, I celebrated that initiative, and I wish that this BC NDP government's commitment extended, Mr. Speaker, to environmental racism. In northern BC, spurred on by this government's record-setting investment and subsidization of the liquefied gas industry, fracking is widespread. We're learning about the tragic and deadly consequences of fracking. We're learning more and more about it every day. Emissions of chemicals that cause and exacerbate birth defects, rare cancers, and asthma. These are disproportionately impacting Indigenous communities, Mr. Speaker. One study from the U.S. found that children born near fracking sites were 25% more likely to be born at low birth weights, or less than 5.5 pounds. They found an increased risk of childhood mortality and poorer educational outcomes. A lead author from the Nobel Peace Prize winning group called Physicians for Social Responsibility called fracking, quote, the worst thing I've ever seen. Through you, Honourable Speaker, to the Premier, does he care that his government is actively engaged in environmental racism against Indigenous communities, particularly Indigenous children and pregnant people?
Minister of Reconciliation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Saanich North and the Islands for the question. In the northeast of British Columbia, where the fracking activity to which he refers primarily occurs, we are engaged in addressing a decision, an historic decision of the BC Supreme Court, namely the Yahé decision. We are doing so with all the Treaty 8 nations who the judge concluded had had their treaty rights, their Treaty 8 rights violated through oil and gas activity. We are engaged in a series of initiatives to heal the land and to do some of the things that the members suggest need to be done. We are doing that in close collaboration and negotiation, not with the victor in that litigation, namely the Blueberry River First Nation, but all the other Treaty 8 nations. We are consulting widely with industry, and we are working with local governments to make sure we get it right.
Member for Saanich North and Islands, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's nothing ethical about LNG development. Neither the government nor the official opposition grasp that, Mr. Speaker. Not only is LNG Canada the single largest point source of emissions in this province, going to be, undermining any efforts that this government is making to combat the climate crisis, it's disproportionately impacting Indigenous people. It's environmental racism, Mr. Speaker. Researchers at the University of Toronto are undertaking further study of the direct impacts of fracking on fetal health, and more research is needed. But instead of contributing to that, the BC Oil and Gas Commission just criticized the existing study. Nobody seems to care about the fact that this study of pregnant people found higher contaminant levels in homes near fracking sites, and that the highest levels of exposure were found among Indigenous pregnant people who participated. Indigenous participants' homes showed notably higher concentration of chloroform, acetone, and decanol. There were higher levels of trihalomethane in their tap water, Mr. Speaker. My question again is to the Premier. How does the Premier reconcile his commitments to Indigenous people while ramping up this fracked gas development that is clearly putting the lives of Indigenous children and pregnant people at risk?
Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation.
Mr. Speaker, I think it is true that there has been a disproportionate impact on Indigenous peoples in the Northeast, and that, of course, was the conclusion of Madam Justice Burke in the Yahé decision to which I previously referred. And that is why, because of that treaty being violated over 100 years or more, we are rolling up our sleeves and doing what the court asked that we do. And in doing so, we will address the impacts that the member refers to. These impacts are real. We are not shying away from that. And indeed, we're taking the kind of steps in partnership with industry, in partnership with local government, to make sure that we have a viable Northeast economy, but that the balance is restruck in a way that works for everyone, those of us who benefit from that activity in the South, but particularly to address the impacts on those who suffer in the Northeast from those consequences. It's not going to be a simple solution, Mr. Speaker, but it's an overdue one, and we're rolling up our sleeves and doing that hard work now.